Medieval nobles had an odd problem. They were statistically safer charging into battle than accepting dinner invitations. In 1378, receiving an elegant invitation sealed with wax might have felt like an honor, until you noticed the servants were unusually well armed and your wine had that peculiar bitter aftertaste. While knights worried about arrows and sword thrusts on the battlefield, the smart money knew the real danger lurked behind banquet tables, disguised as warm hospitality and friendly conversation. There's something darkly ironic about an era where bread was blessed and wine was sacred, yet so many political careers ended over dinner. Medieval dining halls became elaborate murder stages where ambitious nobles turned the sacred act of hospitality into their deadliest weapon. Medieval nobles perfected the art of killing with kindness. They discovered that poison tasted better with good wine, and murder plots went down easier with pleasant conversation. Welcome to the world where every feast could be your last supper, and every toast might be the final sound you ever hear. The assassination menu. Medieval poisoners had a twisted sense of artistry. They preferred their victims to die slowly, publicly, and with just enough time to realize who had outsmarted them. Take Emperor John VIII Palaiologos in 1448. The Byzantine ruler thought he was attending a celebration of military victories when his wine suddenly tasted sweeter than usual. By the third course, his hands were trembling. By dessert, he was convulsing on the marble floor while his loyal advisors watched with carefully neutral expressions. The sweetness? Arsenic mixed with honey, a favorite combination that masked the metallic taste while ensuring a dramatic, unforgettable death. But poisoners weren't just random killers. They were strategic artists who understood that timing was everything. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici learned this lesson in 1521 when his political rivals decided his papal ambitions needed to end. They waited until the most important banquet of the year, a feast celebrating a new alliance, before serving him wine laced with cantarella, a Renaissance favorite made from arsenic and pig's blood. The cardinal spent his final hours vomiting blood while pretending everything was fine, desperately trying to maintain diplomatic appearances even as his organs shut down. The French court elevated poisoning to a science. When Charles V wanted to eliminate his brother-in-law, the Count of Evreux, in 1354, the royal chefs prepared a special dish, roasted peacock stuffed with mercury-soaked herbs. The Count complimented the seasoning even as his nervous system began failing. He died 3 days later, still praising the excellent meal that killed him. Medieval assassins understood psychology better than most therapists. They knew their victims' pride would prevent them from appearing weak or suspicious at public gatherings, so they struck when their targets were most vulnerable, relaxed, social, and desperately trying to maintain their powerful image while poison coursed through their veins. Massacre at the high table. Sometimes medieval hosts decided poison was too subtle. They preferred their betrayals loud, bloody, and witnessed by hundreds of terrified guests. The Black Dinner of 1440 remains Scotland's most infamous example of hospitality gone horribly wrong. 10-year-old William Douglas and his younger brother David accepted an invitation from their supposed protector, Sir William Crichton, to dine at Edinburgh Castle. The boys arrived excited, dressed in their finest clothes, expecting a celebration. Instead, they found themselves staring at a bull's head placed deliberately at the center of the high table, the traditional Scottish symbol of death. Before the Douglas brothers could process what they were seeing, Crichton's men seized them. The other guests sat frozen as the children were dragged to the castle courtyard and beheaded on the spot. Their crime? Being born into a family that threatened Crichton's political ambitions. The remaining diners finished their meal in horrified silence, understanding that they had just witnessed what happened to anyone who crossed their host. But Scotland wasn't the only place where dinner invitations doubled as death warrants. In 1461, Edward IV of England invited the Earl of Devon and his son to what they believed was a reconciliation feast. After years of Civil War tensions, the Earl should have noticed that the servants kept their swords unusually close, and that other nobles seemed strangely absent. Halfway through the main course, Edward's soldiers surrounded the table. Father and son were executed before the wine had finished breathing. Wedding feasts proved especially deadly because guests arrived unarmed and relaxed, making them perfect targets for mass slaughter. The Red Wedding wasn't just a Game of Thrones plot device. Medieval history is littered with marriage celebrations that ended in bloodbaths, where bride and groom became widow and corpse before the dancing even began. Medieval nobles learned to read table settings like battle formations, understanding that surviving a feast required the same tactical awareness as surviving a siege. The politics of betrayal. Medieval feasts operated on a cruel paradox. The closer you sat to your host, the more likely you were to leave in a coffin. Consider the twisted friendship between King John of England and William de Braos in 1208. De Braos had been John's most trusted ally, sharing countless meals and intimate conversations about kingdom politics. But when de Braos's wife publicly questioned the suspicious death of John's nephew, the king decided their friendship needed a permanent ending. John invited the de Braos family to a reconciliation feast at Corfe Castle, promising to clear the air over good food and wine. De Braos arrived with his wife and eldest son, probably relieved that years of tension were finally ending. The meal started pleasantly enough, familiar jokes, shared memories, the comfortable rhythm of old friends. Then John raised his goblet for a toast. Instead of friendship, he announced treason charges. Instead of pardons, he offered starvation. The de Braos family was imprisoned in the castle dungeons, where they slowly died of hunger while John continued hosting dinner parties directly above their heads. The Byzantine court perfected betrayal with almost scientific precision. Emperor Michael VII thought he could trust his military commander, Nikephoros Botaniates, enough to invite him for private dinners throughout 1078. They discussed strategy, shared wine, and Botaniates even brought gifts for the emperor's children. Meanwhile, Botaniates was systematically bribing Michael's guards, mapping the palace layout, and planning a coup that he finalized over their final meal together. Within weeks, Michael found himself dethroned by the man who had been eating at his table for months. Medieval nobles understood that trust was their most dangerous luxury. The friend who knew your favorite wine also knew when you'd be most relaxed. The ally who shared your private concerns also knew your deepest fears. And the dinner companion who laughed at your jokes might be the same person planning your funeral before dessert arrived. Breaking bread had become breaking necks, and medieval politics proved that your worst enemy often wore the face of your closest friend. Blood in the wine! The art of medieval assassination through food reached its twisted perfection with masters who treated murder like a carefully choreographed dance. And no family danced more elegantly with death than the Borgias. Although the Borgias operated more during the Renaissance period, they serve as the ultimate example of techniques that medieval poisoners had been perfecting for centuries. Cesare Borgia didn't invent the dinner party assassination. He just elevated it to an art form that would make earlier medieval killers jealous. Medieval poisoners had already established the basic playbook by the 1300s. They understood that certain mushrooms could mimic heart failure, that mercury poisoning looked suspiciously like natural illness, and that the right combination of herbs could kill someone weeks after a single meal. But they lacked the Borgias' theatrical flair and scientific precision. Take the mysterious death of Pope John VIII in 882, one of the earliest recorded cases of papal poisoning. His enemies chose a particularly cruel method. They served him wine laced with ground glass and slow-acting plant toxins. The Pope spent days feeling increasingly unwell, blaming age and stress, while his digestive system slowly shredded itself from the inside. His killers walked free because medieval forensics couldn't distinguish between creative murder and divine punishment. The technique became so common that medieval nobles developed elaborate food testing rituals. They employed official tasters, demanded that servants eat first, and some paranoid rulers even carried personal antidotes to dinner parties. But poisoners adapted faster than their victims could protect themselves. By the time the Borgias arrived, they inherited centuries of refined murder techniques. Medieval assassins had already figured out that antimony created heart attack symptoms, that certain snake venoms could be concentrated into wine, and that a skilled poisoner could make someone die exactly when politically convenient. The medieval period didn't just tolerate poisoning. It practically invented it as a legitimate political tool, creating a bloody legacy that families like the Borgias would later perfect into high art. When hospitality hides murder, medieval society created the perfect murder weapon by making hospitality sacred, and then watching ambitious nobles weaponize that very sanctity against their enemies. The laws of medieval hospitality were supposedly unbreakable. Once you accepted someone's bread and salt, you were under their protection. Your host was bound by sacred duty and divine law to keep you safe. This beautiful tradition created an atmosphere of trust that made guests deliciously vulnerable to betrayal. Harold Hardrada learned this lesson fatally in 1066, though not in the way most people remember. Before his famous death at Stamford Bridge, Harold had survived dozens of battles by never trusting anyone completely. But when Earl Tostig invited him to a private strategy meeting disguised as a feast, Harold's guard dropped. The Norwegian king knew that medieval custom protected him once he entered Tostig's hall. What he didn't know was that Tostig had already sold his location to King Harold Godwinson's scouts, who surrounded the building during the meal. Harold escaped that particular dinner, but the intelligence gathered during his relaxed evening led directly to his death weeks later. The most chilling aspect wasn't the murders themselves. It was how hosts maintained perfect etiquette while orchestrating slaughter. They followed every ritual of medieval hospitality right up until the moment they violated it completely. They blessed the bread, poured the wine, offered the best seats, made pleasant conversation, and then watched their guests die with the same calm attention they'd given to serving dinner. Medieval chroniclers recorded case after case of nobles who died clutching goblets, still trying to thank their hosts even as poison burned through their systems. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical murder. Victims died knowing they had been betrayed by someone who had just finished washing their feet and blessing their meal. By the late medieval period, accepting a dinner invitation required the same courage as charging into battle. The difference was that on the battlefield, you could see your enemies coming. Renaissance courts inherited medieval paranoia about food, creating elaborate tasting rituals that survive in diplomatic protocol today. The next time you raise a glass at dinner, remember that medieval nobles would have envied your casual trust. They lived in a world where every toast carried the possibility of betrayal, every shared meal was a potential last supper, and every dinner invitation might be an elegantly written death sentence.